So what, if anything, has this mission changed for the United States and China? Joining me now from Beijing is Yang Guang, Secretary of the International Astronautical Federation. Well, this is an historic mission because, as you know, the U.S. and China, they don't normally work together in space. In fact, as Sean pointed out, there's a U.S. law that prevents it. Do you get any sense that the restrictions could be softening some?
Well, actually speaking, firstly, I also thought it is impossible because of the restrictions raised by the U.S. Congress. But the things changed in 2014. In that year, the International Astronautical Congress held in Toronto, and the NanoRacks has a booth. And they introduced to me the possibility of providing the service for some small experiments to the ISS. They say that NanoRacks has its own standard racks on board the ISS. So I talked a lot about this possibility, and also Professor Zhang Fengyuan acted as a bridge between the NanoRacks and Beijing Institute of Technology, and finally they made it. So it is really possible for these kind of cooperations between private companies and also the China side. And this is very meaningful because in the future, even if the US Congress have these kind of restrictions, but still we can do something. The space science, the space biology, and also the fluid physics, and also the material manufacturing has great demands in the to performing experiments in microgravity field. So these kind of demands should be met by all the space capable nations and utilize the resources more efficiently. So these countries should open to the whole world to provide these kind of services, such as the what has been done by the China Manned Space Agency.
Well, and also, I mean, you look at the situation now, the United States and Russia, the relationship really not going very well. And then you look at how the U.S. and Russia has worked together on the International Space Station, that kind of cooperation. It's benefited both countries, hasn't it?
Exactly. The US and Russia exchange their knowledge and benefit from the cooperation on the ISS. It is really a pity that China has not attended the ISS program. But in the future, China's Manned Space Agency has already announced that China's space station will be open to the whole world. So not only China, Russia will benefit from it, but also many other countries. You see that Professor Roberto Battiston, the chief of the Italian Space Agency, and Mr. Wang Zhaoyao, the chief of the China Manned Space Agency, has already signed a treaty for the cooperation on the space station program. And also China has signed some treaty with the United Nations to have some programs in the onboard China's future space station. I hope that in the future there are also more chance for Chinese scientists to perform their experiments onboard the ISS. So these resources are very valuable, and these resources, as I mentioned, should be used more efficiently to coordinate all kinds of these experiments. So you see that the Beijing Institute of Technology has similar space life science experiment onboard the Tiangong-1. So this time on the ISS, it is you can recognize as a continuous experiment. So these kind of we can see more of these kind of experiments in the future, either on board China space station or on board the ISS. So the whole world will benefit from it.
Yeah, China's space program, obviously one of the fastest growing in the world. You're describing basically a situation where they're going to be a lot more open to other nations. So give me your sense, what happens in space, does it translate down on the ground? I mean, do you think it can help with diplomacy in the world that we live in here on Earth?
Well, of course, there are direct returns from the space experiments, and also there are indirect returns from the space build. For instance, you know that recently China performed the Tiangong-2 space laboratory and the Tianzhou-1 missions. On board the Tiangong-2, there are experiments called the ultra-cold atomic clock, which be much accurate than the atomic clocks used before. If this experiment can be successful in the future, the navigation satellite system will be more accurate and more practical and more convenient to use for the common users on the Earth. So every activities in space, either manned space activities or the robotic missions, will benefit the common people like you and me. And the only thing we can do is just to wait, because most of the returns are indirect ones.
All right, Mr. Yang, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us from Beijing.